topic today is the cross and the flag, Christianity and American identity. Before I jump in and give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I want to address probably a thought that some of you are having right now, which is this, right? That, America is a religiously plural nation. There are all kinds of faiths here from all over the world. So why just kind of single out Christianity? I think pretty early on, you'll understand why I'm doing that. If the goal of this class is to understand some aspects of like the central character of American identity, Christianity is absolutely at the center of that, love it or hate it. So we're going to start with some contemporary examples. I guess contemporary-ish. 9/11 is not contemporary, over 20 years ago. But we're going to look at some of the responses to the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in 2001. And we're going to compare that with a recent, and I think really consequential Supreme Court decision, the Hobby Lobby decision. We're going to have to go back and talk about something that happened before the founding, which is the Protestant Reformation, and look at how it shaped the founding. And then we're going to look at the founding. This is going to be a long section. There's a lot of issues related to this. And after that, we're going to be taking a break. After the break, we're going to pick up by talking about Christian nationalism. Kind of what is it? Where did it come from? And then we're going to be looking at Christian nationalism today. So there are a lot of people who believe that Christian nationalism is not on a lot of people's radars and should be, because it is a core feature driving so much of our political culture today. September 11th, 2001. Long story short, there was a terrorist organization in Afghanistan called Al-Qaeda who orchestrated several devastating attacks on the United States of America, probably the most famous and most destructive being the two planes that got flown into the Twin Towers in New York City, as well as a plane that almost got flown into the Pentagon, which you're seeing right here on the right. It was revealed shortly after that these attacks were largely orchestrated by a man named Osama bin Laden, who was an influential leader in the Al-Qaeda movement. About 9/11, but I want to focus on this particular issue, which is shortly after 9/11 happened, several very influential conservative Christians came out and basically said that 9/11 was God judging America. So who are we looking at here? So on the left, we're looking at Jerry Falwell, who was an extremely influential conservative Christian leader throughout the 80s through the early 2000s. He has since passed away. And on the right here, we're looking at Pat Robertson, who is still alive, although not as influential as he used to be, but at that time was, again, another really influential conservative Christian. He was kind of the head of the Christian Broadcasting Network, which is still to this day a really kind of influential cable channel for conservative Christians, particularly older conservative Christians. And here's what they said. So Jerry Falwell said, so basically this was in, I think it's just like a radio program. He was actually speaking to Pat Robertson and said this, and I know that I'll hear from them for this, them being like liberal critics, basically. But throwing God out successfully with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools, the abortionists have got to bear some burden for this being the 9/11 attacks. Because God will not be mocked, and we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, these are like kind of left-leaning advocacy organizations. All of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. And Pat Robertson basically agreed, well, I totally concur. And the problem is we have adopted that agenda at the highest levels of our government. So we're responsible as a free society for what the top people do. And the top people, of course, is the court system. So there's a lot of ideas here, but the short version is this, that this view represents a dominant view that a lot of people had then and a lot of people have now. And there's a lot going on here, but the short version is, the view is that America is kind of God's chosen nation in some kind of complicated way. And when we disobey God by doing things like getting abortions and accepting feminism and accepting gay and lesbian people, that makes God angry, and that God has to judge us when we're angry, and that's what 9/11 is. And again, this was not a fringe view. There were millions of Americans who believe this, and unfortunately, and we see here, this is a protester of the time. It's not a phobia if they are killing you. Who's they? Well, they is Muslim people. And unfortunately, one of the immediate results of this was kind of a rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric, sentiment, and also violence, as we see here.
For American Muslims, 9/11 brought the same loss felt by every American, but it also triggered an onslaught of anti-Muslim sentiment that has only risen in the decades since. In 2002, just 25% of Americans believed Islam was more likely than other religions to encourage violence. Now, that number is at 50%, according to Pew Research. Joining me now is my good friend and MSNBC anchor Yasmin Basugian, who sat down with a panel of American Muslims to reflect on the last 20 years. So quite a conversation, Yasmin. What did you learn from this panel, and what did they have to tell you about their experiences?
Eamon, it was actually such an emotional conversation. A couple of the panelists actually, tearing up during it, kind of recounting the moments on 9/11 and how their lives changed so dramatically after that. It really was a turning point for so many people across this country and across the world for so many different reasons, obviously being so tragic, the downfall of those towers and the lives lost there. But for these American Muslims, they had a very different experience in that their safety and security in their own communities, the questioning of who they were and what they stood for, were coming into question in this country with the rise of Islamophobia because of the Twin Towers and the loss there. So I wanted to sit down with them and have a frank conversation about that. Let's listen.
I remember thinking I should go home and just feeling like fear.
My wife goes down to Ground Zero for the next several days.
Wow.
And sets up the first triage centers and the first pharmacies. Somebody said to her, a fellow Arab, said to her, "I'd cover my name if I was you."
At one point, a guidance counselor said to my face, we don't want your kind here. You have to leave. And I was there to ask whether I should be in AP chemistry.
Now, just to be clear, not all conservatives or not all Christians or not all, not all people who supported, responding to September 11th were perpetrating this, but it was enough that it definitely people were noting a significant uptick in resentment, frustration, again, violence towards Muslim people. So let's move on now to case study 2, which is going to feel completely unrelated at first, but I think I can tie it in a way that makes sense. So in 2014, there was a Supreme Court decision called Burwell versus Hobby Lobby stores. It is considered a landmark decision. Landmark meaning it was, big freaking deal, very consequential. I'm going to play a video about it just to kind of explain it to you a little bit, and then I'll unpack some things.
The Supreme Court recently ruled that Hobby Lobby has the right to limit what contraceptives are offered in its employees' healthcare plan. A decision that some people are calling a win for religious rights and others are calling a loss for women's rights. So what is Hobby Lobby and what did the court actually decide? Well, Hobby Lobby is an arts and crafts company based out of Oklahoma City with more than 500 locations around the U.S. It's a privately held corporation owned by devout evangelical Christians. They claim that some contraceptives offered under the Affordable Care Act are against their religious beliefs and they didn't want to be complicit in providing their employees access to these birth control measures. 5 out of 9 judges on the Supreme Court agreed with Hobby Lobby and ruled in their favor. Still, this ruling is very controversial. According to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the dissent to the Supreme Court's decision, there are tons of reasons the court should have decided against Hobby Lobby. First off, what about Hobby Lobby's female employees and their freedoms? Doesn't this decision deny these employees access to contraception? Employees who may not even share Hobby Lobby's beliefs.
All right, Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc. is a landmark Supreme Court case which supporters say significantly expanded religious liberties. Again, expanded religious liberties in terms of the conservative, individual or family that was running Hobby Lobby felt like allowing their employees to even choose birth control, went against their religious liberties, right? And Supreme Court agreed. However, critics claim it erroneously secured new liberties the Constitution never intended. So again, conservatives, religious people often said, well, this is a restoration of religious liberties that, liberals and progressives have taken away from us, whereas liberals and progressives were like, no, this is an expansion that the founders never intended. So let's put these two together and ask, what do they have in common? I mean, at first glance, maybe not much, but I think it maybe it's kind of obvious, right? Right. So in both cases, there was a particular understanding of American Christianity that was fueling both of these movements. And that is what we're going to look at today. And before we do that, here's just some survey data, because religious piety, basically Americans are just more religious than other countries like us, right? And here's just some stats showing that. I'll just give you a second to kind of glance down this list. But as you can see, by almost every metric, Americans are just more religiously observant than Western Europe in general. Chart specifically responding to the question, do you believe in the God of the Bible? On every question related to that, Americans were overwhelmingly more likely to say yes than people in Western Europe.
And speaking of surveys, on the survey you took at the beginning of class, I asked you this question, what was your religious identity? And here's the results of that survey.
And before presenting that data, just a little kind of note here. Anytime you see an asterisk on this table, it denotes a comment with a qualifier, such as someone kind of noting like, well, I'm this, but I'm in a particular branch of that, particularly Christianity, or no longer practicing, or my beliefs have changed. The data is really interesting. So every time I've taught, this is America, so most people do identify as some form of Christianity, either Protestant, as we see here, or Catholic, or Orthodox Christianity, which is like Eastern Orthodox, right? Now notice, like I think there's 7 asterisks here, so every single Catholic except for one identified with a qualifier. Most of these asterisks are someone saying, I was raised Catholic, but I don't really believe in it anymore. One person said, I was raised Catholic, but I'm kind of looking into more kind of mainstream evangelical Christianity. And here we have, a few non-religious or non-spiritual people. So, I don't really believe in or practice anything. One agnostic, one Hindu person who said that they don't really practice it like they used to. A Muslim, again, Orthodox Christian, and theist. So there's one person who said, I think there's something out there, like a higher power, but I don't know what it is. So again, even in this, relatively small class, we are a reflection of I think kind of the larger religious diversity of the United States. But at the same time, this data demonstrates something I'm going to be talking about a lot today, which is the predominance of Christianity in America.
So here is the big idea. In U.S. society, religion and evangelical Christianity in particular, which again is why we're focusing on that particular persuasion, plays a much bigger role than in similar Western capitalist democracies. And again, we just saw that from the survey data. Here's kind of extending the point for the big idea. There are lots of reasons why. We're going to look at 3 reasons. One is ambiguous church-state clauses in the founding documents. So again, we're going to, we haven't spent much time with the founders recently, so we're going to be spending a lot of time with them today. The legacy of the Protestant Reformation and the persistence of Christian nationalist beliefs. So again, these are 3 different ideas: the founding documents, Protestant Reformation, and Christian nationalist beliefs. However, I think these are the 3 primary reasons, that answer the question, why is America so much more religious, in particular, so much more Christian than, France, England, etc.? Well, I think this is why. So again, we're going to be going all the way back to the era, even a century or 2 before the founding with the Protestant Reformation. And I'm going to be telling kind of a grand story of how Christianity came to be such a powerful force in American life, society, and identity. So, by the way, this is one of my favorite things to lecture on, I think, especially because, as I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of really bad misinformation, even disinformation out there on this topic. And this is something, again, I enjoy kind of enlightening people on, because it's really fascinating, it's really complex, and again, I think it helps explain where we are today as a culture. Now, one disclaimer before we jump into it. This class, I will occasionally need to discuss certain religious teachings and doctrines in order to better understand the nature of faith in the United States. When I present these ideas, please understand that I'm neither endorsing nor opposing these ideas. So some of you, again, based on your survey data, some of you are very religious, some of you are not. Doesn't matter, at least from my perspective, for the purposes of this lecture. And just know that when I talk about, Christians believe X, Y, and Z, or the Bible says this or that, I'm neither attacking nor supporting any particular belief system. If I ever talk about specific Christian dogmas and doctrines, it's so that we can better understand the history. So let's jump in. We're going to start with the Protestant Reformation. But first, even before that, I just have to kind of talk about Christianity a little bit, because I realize that depending on your tradition growing up, you might not even know what Christians actually believe. So here is like the shortest explanation of Christianity that you've ever gotten in your life. You ready? Christianity 101. God made humans, right? Here's Adam and Eve in the garden. Humans rebelled or sinned against God, and God sent his son Jesus to save us. Now, how did Jesus save us? Well, different Christians have different answers to that. So again, I'm being as kind of vague and ecumenical and broad as possible. This is what Christianity teaches. Also, I just want to do, this is like 1,300 years of Christianity in one slide. All right. Christianity started out as a minority religion in the 1st century Roman Empire, which is what we see here depicted on the left, but became the religion of the empire in 380. For the next 1,200 years, Western European Christianity was dominated by Roman Catholicism. Western European Christianity because there are other forms of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, etc., which were developing at the time as well. But in terms of the history of the United States, in terms of the people, right, who are coming in large numbers and colonizing North America in the 1700s, this is the most important context. So for the next 1,200 years, Western Christianity was dominated by Roman Catholicism. The Catholic Church dominated the religious, political, and economic systems throughout the era, right? So in other words, the Catholic Church was not just a church, it was basically the basic foundation for, Christendom, for kind of Western European society for, again, roughly 1300 years. So what changed? Well, the Protestant Reformation changed that. I'm going to pause here and let John Green from Crash Course explain the Protestant Reformation to you.
So during the European Middle Ages, the Catholic Church really dominated European civilization. It's almost impossible to imagine the scope of the Church's power in the Middle Ages, but let's try. First off, the Catholic Church was the caretaker of the most important thing that Christians had, their souls, which, unlike our temporal bodies, were eternal. And then there was the parish priest, who played a pivotal role throughout every person's life, baptizing them, marrying them, hearing their confessions, providing last rites. The church also provided all of the social services. It distributed alms to the poor and ran orphanages and provided what education was available. And most Europeans would, in their lives, meet exactly one person who could read the Bible, which was only available in Latin: their parish priest. And the church owned over 1/3 of all the land in Europe, which helped make it the most powerful economic and political force on the continent. And the Pope claimed authority over all the kings of Europe as the successor to the Roman emperor. So this was a very powerful institution, and it was undone by one chronically constipated monk. Here at Crash Course, we don't like to get too into great man history, but the Reformation really was initiated and shaped by one man, Martin Luther. No, Stan, the Martin Luther he was named for. No, Stan, the Martin Luther that he was named for. Yes. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Luther studied law, and like most law students, he hated it. Then one day, a sudden storm blew up, lightning struck him to the ground, and in a panic, he cried, "Help me, Saint Anne, I'll become a monk." He survived, and in the next 2 weeks, he withdrew from university, entered an Augustinian monastery, took his vows, and sent a message to inform his family, who I'm sure were delighted to have spent all that money on education because monking is so lucrative. In 1505, Luther was sent to Rome on a diplomatic mission, and he ignored all the awesome art and focused instead on Rome's corruption, with prostitutes openly soliciting on the filthy streets, priests who made light of their duties hurrying through Mass so fast that it seemed to mean nothing, and openly deriding church doctrine. Luther was obsessed with his own sinfulness, and he kept confessing incessantly. And finally, his confessor and teachers sent him to the University of Wittenberg because, they were a little bit annoyed with him, and they figured he'd be good at teaching scripture. These days, of course, incessant confessors are put on the Real Housewives of New Jersey, but back then you sent them to the University of Wittenberg. Anyway, Luther finally found his answer in St. Paul's epistles, specifically in one line that said, "The just shall live by faith." In other words, salvation comes through faith, not good works, not through prayer or fasting or vigils or pilgrimages or relics or giving to the poor or the sacraments or any action that a person can take. We can't ever be good enough through our actions to merit salvation. We can only have faith. In Latin, sola fide. Only faith. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Martin Luther's new interpretation of sola fide grew into a full-scale conflict with the Catholic Church when a friar named John Tetzel came to Wittenberg selling indulgences. An indulgence was a donation to the church that came with a promise from the Pope to reduce a sinner's time in purgatory. Like, to quote from an indulgence that Friar Tetzel sold, "I replace thee in the state of innocence and purity in which thou wert at the hour of thy baptism." Luther felt like that wasn't the sort of thing that, should be for sale. The price of this whole life complete forgiveness of any horrible sin certificate, by the way, was 3 marks, probably about half a year's wages for a laborer. So Luther didn't like seeing his parishioners handing over money that they didn't have for a scrap of paper that he believed to be meaningless. So in response, he wrote 95 theses against indulgences and then dramatically nailed them to the church door for all to see on October 31st, 1517, or else he mailed them to the archbishop, or possibly both. We don't actually know. This led to a series of debates with other men of the cloth, during which Luther's positions became increasingly radical. Starting from the statement that Christians were saved only through faith and the grace of God, for instance, Luther then upped the ante, saying that the church's rituals didn't have the power to save souls. And then he argued that far from being infallible, the church and the Pope made errors all the time. That was a pretty bold thing to say, and then it got even more dramatic when Luther ultimately denied that the church and the officers of it had any spiritual powers. He said that the priesthood was a human invention and that individual Christians didn't even need priests to receive the grace of God. Instead, Luther described a priesthood of all believers. Plenty of radical friars had criticized the church's abuses and hypocrisies over the years. Why would Luther prove influential? Well, one reason was the printing press. Now, most people in Europe at the time couldn't read, but a lot of people could, including, of course, a lot of priests, and over 2,000 editions of Luther's writings appeared between 1517 and 1526. And his ideas also appeared in pamphlets and posters and cartoons that were seen and read aloud, reaching millions of readers and listeners. In short, Luther's ideas were all over like the Tumblr of the day, which was a town crier and broadsides nailed to doors. And it caused quite a stir, especially the stuff about like the Pope being the Antichrist sent by the devil. Like I said, it got pretty radical. But maybe the most revolutionary of Luther's publications was his new translation of the Bible into German. For the first time ever, non-priests could read the Bible for themselves because Luther used the German that people actually spoke instead of Latin, and his work quickly caught on among common people. Hundreds of thousands of copies of Luther's Bible were printed. People carried it in their pockets and memorized it. Now everyone could quote scripture and discuss its meaning. Now, Luther's theory was that if everyone just returned directly to the scriptures, they would see the one single truth, and the church would be restored to its original simplicity. Yeah, no, I have a message to the restorers of history. There is no original simplicity! The thing is, once you start making scripture accessible to everyone and tell them that their opinions are just as good as those of the clergy, what happens is that people start, having different interpretations of what religious truth is. So Luther's protest started creating spin-offs, the Zwinglians and the Calvinists and the Anabaptists, and then the spin-offs had their own spin-offs. It's like how first there was Iron Man, and then there was the Avengers, and then, like an Avengers TV show. Pretty soon we're gonna have Ant-Man get his own movie. The Protestant Reformation is basically just the exact same thing as the Marvel comic universe, but no Thor because he's pagan. Anyway, many of these new denominations will be familiar to you. The Anglicans and Puritans, the Quakers, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists. With all these new denominations, there were years of religious mayhem. Clergy preached radical new ideas, and then other people interpreted them in even more radical ways. People, especially young people, smashed up churches because the Bible says no graven images. What started as a doctrinal dispute turned into a social revolt, and in 1525, German peasants took up Luther's ideas to give voice to long-standing grievances against landlords and clergymen. In their most famous revolutionary proclamation, the 12 Articles, the peasants echoed Luther's language, proclaiming that serfdom was invented by men with no basis in scripture. The peasants rebelled, refused to pay taxes, pillaged church lands, and raised an army estimated at 300,000 people. And Luther was like, yes! Free souls, sovereign at last! No, just kidding, he wasn't. Luther chose the elite and said that Christian liberty was a spiritual concept, not meant to promote equality or freedom in, the physical world. He then urged the faithful to smite, slay, and stab rebels and kill them like mad dogs. He also gave up his idea that congregations should elect their own ministers and argued that kings and princes were put in place by God as caretakers of the church. And that turned out to be the winning side, for a few hundred years anyway. The German Peasants' Revolt, the biggest revolutionary uprising in Europe before the French Revolution, was suppressed with crushing brutality. An estimated 100,000 people were killed. So in the end, the Reformation was both a religious movement and a political one. Now, many argue that the Reformation eventually led to more religious toleration in Europe because people just had to learn to live with each other once they had a bunch of wars and figured out that there were going to be both Catholic and Protestants moving forward. There were many other effects of the Protestant Reformation. Max Weber famously called it the foundation of European capitalism. But for me, the most crucial aspect of the Protestant Reformation is contained inside the words protest and reform. These have become two of the central political ideas in recent centuries. And while religion has justifiably been blamed for much violence and intolerance, we should also remember that many of the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance, were Protestant clergy. And they saw a history of protest that could fuel real and lasting reform that included people like Gandhi and Thoreau, but also people like Martin Luther. Thanks for watching.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video, and I just want to pull out the parts that I think are the most important. So ML is Martin Luther, again, saving time. So Martin Luther was a German monk who aggressively pushed for reforms against perceived abuses and corruption in the Catholic Church. So here is a aesthetic representation of Martin Luther, and again, he was a monk, so he's kind of wearing what for that time was traditional monk clothing. And here is Martin Luther nailing his 95 Thesis, which again was basically a list of 95 grievances that he had against the Catholic Church to the door of a local cathedral, which may or may not have happened. But even if it did happen, that was really common back then, right? Because, there was no internet, there was no newspapers. So this is how people kind of spread information, right? It was just by putting things that they had printed in public. And this is what he was mad about, right? So here was an indulgence. And again, an indulgence was basically a piece of paper you bought from the Catholic Church saying, hey, your aunt or your great uncle or cousin who's dead has just been rescued out of purgatory because you paid a whole bunch of money to the Catholic Church, right? And he was like, well, A, this is like a terrible thing that's wasting people's money, and B, it's not in the Bible, which is true, it's not in the Bible. He was also not a fan of relics. So relics were basically either items or like even pieces of like the bodies of famous saints. And they were believed to have basically we would now kind of call magical powers, right? And people would often travel in a pilgrimage, which is another thing he was upset about, right? There was an expectation that if you were a good Catholic and you could afford to do so, you'd make a pilgrimage to various holy sites. Oftentimes these holy sites had relics that you would like pray to, right? And basically Martin Luther was like, hey, I'm reading the Bible, this stuff's not in there, right? Which he was right. I'm not saying his beliefs are right, but if you just read the Bible, these were beliefs and practices that had developed over time from kind of Catholic traditions. They didn't come from the Bible, and he thought that was wrong. And he also was not a fan of this. So in the Bible, there's a section where Jesus is talking to Peter, who's one of the primary apostles, kind of like leader followers of Jesus. And he basically tells Peter, upon this rock, I will build my church. Peter, by the way, means rock in its original language. So long story short, part of Catholic theology is this idea that Peter was the first pope, right? That basically Peter was kind of endowed with this authority that was uniquely given to one person, and then that authority and power has been kind of passed down over the centuries and millennia. And Martin Luther was like, I don't think that's right. When I read the Bible, I don't see this belief actually in there. So he was basically just kind of like taking down almost like everything that Roman Catholicism was telling people to believe, right? So he had a lot of ideas. I this is kind of my commentary. I think his most radical idea was sola fide, which is Latin for faith alone. The belief that only faith and not good deeds or the blessings of the church or pilgrimages, right, or relics, all these other things, these things can't save you. The only thing that can save you is believing in Jesus's death and resurrection, right? And he was reading the Bible. He was getting, and in his interpretation of the Bible, that's what he was coming away with. And he was just getting increasingly disgusted and frustrated with the Catholic Church for, like, in his view, putting all these other beliefs on people and just burdening people with them, right? And today, the vast majority of Christians, especially in America, still believe that, right? This idea that the only thing that can save us is faith in Jesus. Now, again, that was not the belief of Christians necessarily for centuries, but Martin Luther, in his reading of the Bible, believed this was the basic teaching of Christianity, right? And he started acting on his beliefs, right? He started printing Bibles. Now you're like, okay, well, big deal. Bibles are everywhere. You can find Bibles on the internet for free, right? Well, it was a big deal for the time because the printing press had only been around for, a few decades, I believe, at this point, and most people could not read. But if they could read, they could read German, but the Bible wasn't printed in German; it was printed in Latin. So basically, the only people who could read the Bible were educated folks, monks, priests, nuns, etc. And Martin Luther thought this was dumb, so he started printing the Bible in kind of everyday German, and it was a big deal. It was a huge bestseller, and people were just excited for the first time, like, hey, I can read the Bible for myself. I don't have to just believe what my Catholic priest tells me. Large sections of Western Europe, including England, embraced Protestantism. So again, Protestantism, protest, right? That's where we get the Protestant Reformation. It was a protest movement. And eventually, whole kind of regions of Europe and eventually whole countries split from the Catholic Church. And then these groups further fractured into endless sects and offshoots. Sometimes people will ask, well, why are there so many Christian denominations? Well, we kind of have the Protestant Reformation to thank for that. I mean, for the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe, there was one denomination. And today there are thousands of Christian denominations all around the world. And that is a really important legacy of the Protestant Reformation. And here's just a little graphic showing that. So there are so many groups, and it's showing, this is kind of like a long historical thing. It's showing these various schisms, but look at Protestantism, all these different groups break off, right? And this is not even all of them. This is just some of the more dominant major ones. But regardless, the result was Christianity started just becoming more diverse, I guess is the best way to put it. Lots of different groups believing lots of different things. And unfortunately, this led to religious conflicts, which, by the way, kind of preview. This is part of the reason why the founders were so insistent on putting like religious liberties in the founding documents, because they knew about all this history, right? This led to religious conflicts, which drove some, for example, the Puritans, to leave Europe for the New World for religious freedom. Founders were overwhelmingly Protestant and built religious liberties into the founding documents. Again, well, why did they care so much about religious liberties? Because of this stuff. I mean, there were basically 2 centuries of violent, bloody, destructive conflict throughout various parts of Europe, largely because of religious differences, right? Basically, the Protestant Reformation in particular. I mean, these wars started before the Protestant Reformation, but they got really, really, really heated and intense and ugly after the Protestant Reformation, as Catholics and Protestants are fighting each other, and then different Protestants are fighting each other because, like, well, I have the best interpretation and you don't, so we need to kill you, right? I mean, it was really, 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 really ugly stuff. And again, the founders knew about all this stuff. In some cases, the founders, their ancestors had like fled to Europe to get away from that stuff. So invariably, it was going to shape the ideas that made it into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And again, just one example of this, right? You probably know about the Puritans. Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving? There's a lot of reasons. Part of it is a kind of, I would say, kind of like mythic and historically inaccurate, remembrance of this early period when small groups of kind of working class, basically religious dissenters, came to various parts of North America and started their own little communities and colonies. So again, this religious conflict, but also this kind of religious freedom that the Protestant Reformation had unleashed, right? People reading the Bible for themselves, coming up with their own interpretations. All of this history and culture and kind of background, right, was brought by various populations as they're coming to North America in the centuries before we became an independent country. So let's switch gears and ask, how did these ideas specifically shape the founders? And this next section is going to be kind of lengthy because there's so much here to unpack. I mean, I could probably teach an entire class just on this issue. So again, this is going to be very, very kind of cursory, but hopefully I think really interesting, particularly given the fact that there's, again, a lot of disinformation out there on this topic. Basically, in this section, I'm going to answer kind of 3 questions. Those questions are, what did the founders believe and who cares? Right? Again, you might be like, I don't care what Thomas Jefferson believed about God, but there are lots of people who do. And I'm going to explain to you why people care about these questions, but also explore, just broadly speaking, the founders were diverse. They believed a lot of different things, but we can kind of aggregate their beliefs and make some kind of broad generalizations. Second question I'm going to deal with is, what do the First Amendment's religion clauses mean? So in the First Amendment, everybody's favorite amendment, there are 2 really important clauses that I want to just detail and explain. And then third question, how did the founders envision church-state relations? So start with the first question, what do the founders believe and who cares? And I think kind of a fun little thought experiment, a fun way to approach this question is by asking these questions. Did the framers of Cameroon's constitution attend regular religious services? Did the writers of Portugal's founding documents believe in a personal immanent God or a distant uninvolved deity? And finally, did the ratifiers of South Korea's constitution base their governmental structures on biblical principles and religious doctrines? Now, you're probably thinking, I don't care, right? Who cares? Why do these questions matter? These questions have nothing to do with like the business of founding documents and governing. And exactly, right? That is the point, right? The reason I ask these questions is to kind of illustrate, in some ways, the absurdity of that question. However, I think it's important to answer this question, even if you're thinking this, even if you're like, this is a dumb question. But no, it's actually not a dumb question because, again, in America, we do things differently. So in America, this is an important question. So let's unpack this a little bit. And to start with, here's just some evidence, right? This is a poll from, I think, a year or 2 ago, so it's relatively recent. 45% of Americans say the U.S. should be a Christian nation. But they hold differing opinions about what that phrase means. And 2/3 of U.S. adults say churches should keep out of politics, right? So, wow, there's a lot of conflicting and contradictory ideas here, right? America should be a Christian nation, but we don't all agree with what that means. And, so again, this is why this question of what did the founders believe is important, because a lot of Americans think it's important. The founders overwhelmingly believed that God existed, and that is just borne out from their writings. The founders wrote a lot, and people have pored over these writings, and this is generally true. Some were Orthodox Christians. So what I mean by Orthodox, I mean they held to the kind of historic Christian beliefs that Jesus is the Son of God and that the Bible is God's kind of inspired book, etc. But only a few were. Only maybe like 4 or 5 of the founders were actually Orthodox Christians. Others, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, believed in nature's God, which is a deist concept in which the creator had no dealings with humanity. So what is deism? So it's not, we're not really going to dig in that today, but basically it was kind of an Enlightenment belief that like, so it's often called like the watchmaker theory, right? That like God, that like God kind of, you know, wound the earth up like an old school colonial era watch, and then kind of like stepped away from it and just let it run by itself. And some founders believe that, right? That there was a being out there called God, but that God wasn't really doing much for us. However, that was neither the Orthodox position nor the kind of hardcore deistic view kind of represented the dominant view among the founders. So what was the dominant view? So if you had to kind of like average all the founders together, this is what you would get. Most believed in providence, which was a middle ground between orthodoxy and deism. In this view, God intervened in the revolution and the founding. So the founders overwhelmingly believed that like there was a God and that God did something, and specifically that the events of the revolution and the early founding era were that basically, I guess a good word is like God was like shepherding, right? That God was overseeing these events. However, this is extremely important. Providence was a nebulous meaning kind of like vague, was a nebulous Enlightenment concept that did not comport with the beliefs of Orthodox Christianity. So you won't find the word providence in the Bible. You won't see this view that like God is kind of controlling things, but like it's not really clear when and where or if God, or like to what extent God is controlling things, right? And again, this was a vague, broad term that came out of the Enlightenment. So here's a quote from George Washington to kind of illustrate this. The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this. So conspicuous meaning obvious, in all this meaning, you know, the revolution and the early founding era, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. So in other words, what we're saying is, if you don't believe that God had been helping, you know, America get on its feet, then you're just a wicked infidel. Now, some people look at this and say, well, this is proof that George Washington was a Christian. But again, if you put this quote in its context and you look at all of the times the founders used providence, you will see that they're not talking about the God that's revealed in the Bible. They're talking about this kind of like nebulous Enlightenment God that was very much like a product of the kind of intellectual fervor of the Enlightenment, and was not a product of like careful readings of the scriptures. Here's another example from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is not a Christian statement, right? These are not Orthodox Christian beliefs. You won't find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Bible. And this whole question of like human beings having basic rights, you won't find that in the Bible either. I mean, there are some very broad teachings about how God made everyone and everyone's, you know, equal in God's sight. But this specific concept of rights, I mean, that concept just didn't even exist really until the Enlightenment. So building on that point, the founders were overwhelmingly privileged, college-educated elites. The Bible was both a basic text of college education at that time and a shared cultural touchstone with the common folk, so they quoted and alluded to it often. And again, why am I saying all this? Well, people will often say, well, the founders quote the Bible all the time, and they you know, they read the Bible. Well, of course they did. Everybody educated did back then. Also, you know, the founders were like politicians, you know, and then as now, politicians will invoke various ideas and concepts and beliefs that are held by the people that they're trying to get on their side, right? So one final point on this slide, and I think this is like the most important point, honestly. The founders believed, they deeply believed in this idea of virtue. And I think I want to explain what they meant by that, because we use the word virtue today occasionally. It's not a very common word that we use. But the way the founders understood virtue and the way that you might understand virtue are probably very different. So the founders believed that virtue, which they would define as favoring the common good over one's personal interests, they believed that virtue was crucial to the success of the American experiment. This understanding of virtue comes directly from like Greco-Roman thought. So there were particular writers that they were reading, you know, writers who had written stuff thousands of years ago, that were really, really influential in forming this democracy, right? Kind of the world's first modern democracy. And they basically thought, well, democracy is not going to work unless people are not selfish, right? People have to want what's best for the for the republic before they want what's best for themselves. And they considered, back to the slide, they considered religion to be the best promoter of virtue. Their views of religion were far more pragmatic than orthodox, right? So in other words, it's kind of like a logical sequence, right? Democracy is not going to work unless people are virtuous. We need people to be virtuous. The best way for people to be virtuous is to, buy into a religion. And what religion do we have at our disposal? Well, Western Christianity. So of course, right? We want people to be virtuous, so we want people to be Christian, right? And again, it's important to understand kind of the underpinnings of their beliefs. From Ben Franklin to kind of show that only if virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters, right? So if a plurality of Americans were only going to care about what's best for themselves and not care about what's best for the country, things weren't going to work out. So we need virtue, therefore we need religion. And all of these ideas, I think, are expressed in the First Amendment. So let's read it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Let's pause there, right? Two very simple phrases, but actually not so simple. So let's look at each of these one at a time. Historians generally recognize two different religious clauses in the First Amendment, right? The first one being the Establishment Clause. Now, the First Amendment does not say I'm the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause is a title that various legal experts and historians have come up with to identify this. So, what is the Establishment Clause? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, the clause was crafted to prevent the federal government from directly supporting church affairs. So again, in the common language of that time, an establishment was a situation in which a national government supported, or I guess founded and financially supported a church. So this included taxes being diverted to churches and the creation of a federally run church. Let me quickly remind you that when the Bill of Rights was written, it did not yet apply to the states, which will become a really important point very shortly. So in other words, the original meaning of the Establishment Clause was the federal government can't establish a church, right? Now, why? Well, because they were reacting to this, right? They were breaking away from England. They were trying to distinguish, uniquely American way of doing things. And basically, shortly, so it's a long, complicated history, but the short version is this. After England kind of broke away from the Catholic Church for the Protestant Reformation, they basically started their own state church, known as the Church of England or the Anglican Church. And if you were a British subject, part of your taxes went to support the church, whether you believed in the church or not. And the founders were like, we don't want to do that anymore, right? We want to break away from that. That's really at its core what the Establishment Clause is trying to get at. However, and here's where things just get so complicated and messy and muddy. The founders did not envision a firm wall between faith and piety. So sometimes people will say, well, the founders wanted this strict separation between church and state. Unfortunately, that is legitimately not what they wanted. Now, we can say, well, the founders were wrong. that's fine if you think that. But again, as a historian, I'm just trying to say this is what these ideas meant when they were written. So, for example, public prayers, state level church establishment. So in other words, if after the revolution we're states, if North Carolina wants to have a state church, who cares, right? As long as the federal government doesn't have a state church, we're happy. Military chaplains and speeches laden with words like providence and nature's God were common in the founding era. So again, if you are someone who wants to have a strict separation between church and state, you shouldn't look to the founders, because that is not that is not the situation they created. Historians have come up with a term to kind of capture and express this weird, ambiguous quality of the founders' understanding of the church-state relationship, and that word is civil religion. Now, again, civil religion is not a term the founders used. This is a kind of retrospective term, but I think it's an accurate term. So let me define civil religion. It's defined as a cluster of public beliefs, symbols, and rituals that reveal a collective self-understanding that the U.S. was specially set apart by God, right? So again, civil religion is basically a series of practices that the founders either encouraged or allowed to happen that reflected this very nebulous concept that providence was active in early American society. So let me give you some examples that kind of illustrate this. And again, these are examples both current and from the founding era. One is when George Washington, first U.S. president, when he was signed in, he swore on a Bible to be, that he would promised to protect the Constitution, be the president, and all that stuff. Did George Washington choose to do that? Well, we're not 100% sure, but I think the best answer is providence. That George Washington, as most of the founders did, believed that God had some kind of hand in the forming of the American Republic and winning the Revolution. And the best way to demonstrate that publicly when he swore in as president was to put his hand on a Bible. If you look over the writings of the founders, there are statements like this all over the place. And some people will be like, well, this proves he's Christians. Well, no, again, put it in its larger context. Like if you look at the overall ideas of the founders, they overwhelmingly did not have Orthodox Christian views. Like Jesus is the Son of God, the Bible is inspired and given to us by God, right? Most of the founders did not believe those things. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson is, very famously rejected all of the supernatural portions of the Bible, right? Folks like George Washington were actually very tight-lipped about their specific beliefs. But again, I think you have to read statements like this in the larger context of the Enlightenment. For the founders, when they thought about the incredible military victory that they secured over the British Army, they thought, well, the only explanation is that God was on our side, right? And again, providence was the best word for them that captured this belief. And civil religion is still very part of the culture of the United States. For example, the U.S. Senate has their own official chaplain who your taxes pay for. Every time Congress opens in session to this day, they still pray, right? Well, why? Well, that seems like a violation of church and state, right? Well, according to the founders, no. As long as it's like non-sectarian, as long as the specific name of a particular God or religious faith tradition is not invoked, prayers are allowed to happen in Congress. Congress is allowed to have a chaplain, etc. So let's go back to the First Amendment and look at the second part, which is known as the Free Exercise Clause. So the Free Exercise Clause, again, is a term that scholars and historians have come up with to describe this phrase, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So again, just quick refresher, it's part of this larger statement. Congress shall make no law, ... prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? So what does that mean? Well, it basically means that government cannot meddle with or compel religious beliefs, right? So in other words, the government can't make you believe a set of religious doctrines. Now you're probably thinking, well, yeah, of course, the government can't tell you what to believe. But again, this is a really important part of the Enlightenment, right? This idea that we are all individuals responsible for our own beliefs and ideas, and other people can't tell us what to believe. Now, also part of the Enlightenment, which in its most kind of extreme form, there was a very kind of like atheistic streak in the Enlightenment. A few founders were atheists, but again, most of them were not. So I don't think this quote does not represent the founders' views in general. But Voltaire was a French, critic and writer who hated religion. Said this: "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Now, again, this does not represent the dominant view of the founders, but at least I want to just say that this is part of the Enlightenment, right? This idea that human beings should decide what they believe. And for some Enlightenment thinkers, the idea of like some religious authority or some religious text telling you what to believe about God was just ridiculous. That core tenet was shaping the Establishment Clause. However, next point, the founders disagreed over the question of what to do when legitimate government policy violates a particular group's religious views. For example, one question that came up in the founding era was this question. If you were raising an army in wartime, right, that's a legitimate government activity. However, some groups, for example, the Quakers, believed that nonviolence was basically a core religious belief. Now, we're not going to dig too deeply into Quaker beliefs, but let me just say this one thing that is relevant to the current discussion. The Quakers believed that Jesus taught nonviolence. For the Quakers, not defending yourself, not participating in war was a core belief of their theology and their religious practice, right? So what happens when the American Revolution comes along, or when the War of 1812 comes along? And this specific issue came up during the War of 1812, which we're not going to talk about, but you can Google if you want to learn more about it. Quakers refused to participate in the War of 1812, as you can see here, or paid the exemption fee. So you could basically pay a fee to get out of military service, and they were prosecuted for it. However, a few years later, James Madison, who was the fourth president, pardoned them, right? So, what does this all mean? Well, it means this. The founding generation disagreed on this issue, but ultimately decided that in this case, in the case of the Quakers in the War of 1812, the government's interest trumped religious conscience. And again, they were prosecuted, they were basically criminally found guilty of not participating in the War of 1812. However, James Madison pardoned them. So again, there's this really complicated thing. I think this is a good point for me to pause and have you reflect. So choose one of the issues dealt with in the previous section. the founders' religious beliefs, right? What do they believe? What do they not? The First Amendment's religion clauses. Again, you can pick one or both, the Establishment or the Free Exercise Clause, or the Free Exercise Clause. And then finally, civil religion and church-state affairs. If you could go back in time and ask the founders one question about one of these issues, what would it be? It could be clarification, it could be a challenge, whatever. Why do you think this is an important question? So kind of two parts of that. What would you ask them, and then why would you ask them? Post a signed response to the main Lino board. So after I take a little break, we'll pick up with the question, if the founders were not trying to form a Christian nation, why did so many Americans believe that it is? Hi, welcome back. I am titling our next section, Christian Nationhood in the Early Republic. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, let me start with a little case study that I think will explain what issues I'm trying to get at here. In 1797, which was roughly a decade after the Constitution had been ratified, the very young U.S. government signed a treaty with a region of the world known as Tripoli, which you can see here is kind of central North Africa, in which they basically asked Tripoli to help them with open-air piracy. So basically, America had been sending ships to Europe to trade and for other reasons for a while. And one of the big problems at that time was open-air piracy, which you kind of see illustrated here from various pirate groups or cells, or whatever you want to call them, living in North Africa. And they were basically asking Tripoli to help with this. When they were still British colonies, the British Navy was dealing with this problem, but they were not British colonies anymore, so they needed some help. So North Africa at that time was majority Muslim, and the crafters, the people who were writing the language for the Treaty of Tripoli, very carefully crafted this one particular section in which they were kind of acknowledging that. So let me just read it and explain what they're trying to get at. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character or enmity, I don't mean hatred, against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, and as the said states never entered into any war or active hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. What are they talking about? Okay, Mussulman was a term back then for Muslim people, right? And then Mohammedan, that means basically it's like the name Muhammad as an adjective, right? So Muslim. So why are they saying all this? Well, because there was this long history that we kind of dabbled in when we talked about the doctrine of discovery. There's this long history during kind of the Catholic era. Various times, various popes or Catholic leaders would say, hey, we need to go, kill some Muslims and take back the land that they took, from us. Particularly like the Holy Land, like Israel, Jerusalem, all that, right? That people have been fighting over that for centuries. And basically, the United States government was saying, "Hey, we're breaking with this tradition, right? We're entering this treaty with you, and we're just acknowledging that we are not trying to, destroy or attack or offend your religious beliefs, right?" And the best way to say that is to say, "Yeah, we are not a Christian nation." Now, here's the thing. Here's a quote from John Fea, who's a historian I really respect. If the Treaty of Tripoli is correct, and the United States was not founded on the Christian religion, then someone forgot to tell the American people. Okay, two things about this quote. First of all, John Fea is a historian I really respect and appreciate. He actually is a conservative evangelical Christian. However, he is also a fantastic historian and acknowledges that if you sift through the historical data, it's pretty clear that the founders were not trying to create a Christian nation. The other thing about this is that he's kind of basically capturing this idea that even though the founders didn't believe America was a Christian nation, kind of the masses of Americans basically disagreed with the founders and thought very early on that there was this belief bubbling that got bigger and bigger and bigger and eventually became the dominant belief that a lot of Americans held, that America, in fact, was a Christian nation. So that's what we're going to be looking at now is kind of like in intellectual history. Where did this idea come from? And why did so many people believe it then? And why do so many people believe it now? So before really getting into Christian nationalism at the founding, I need to just basically define some terms. And we're kind of using contemporary language. The term Christian nationalism didn't exist back then. However, the ideas and the sentiments actually absolutely did. So again, I'm using modern understandings, just define some basic terms and kind of broadly sketch out how some of these things play out today in American society. And then we're going to go back in the founding era and kind of look at where these beliefs came from and try to connect the then to the now. So the first term we need to define is nationalism. Nationalism is a strong identification with one's own nation and its interests, typically to the exclusion of other nations' interests, right? So when Donald Trump said America first, right? That was a very strong and for a lot of people powerful and persuasive nationalist sentiment. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, because we're going to be talking about Christian nationalism, so we need to define nationalism first. So let's move on. Christian nationalism, then, is a fusing of American and Christian identities. Sometimes abbreviated as CN, Christian nationalism is a broad movement that includes. So again, broad movement meaning not everybody who identifies with Christian nationalism interprets it the same ways, and some people who have Christian nationalist ideas maybe don't identify with that term. So again, using kind of what's happening today in American society, I'm just going to sketch out some very broad kind of spectrum, I guess, of beliefs that kind of encompass Christian nationalism. So belief one, the belief that God and the U.S. have a special relationship. Again, there are millions of Americans who believe that somehow God is involved in what America does. But again, that's a very broad belief that encompasses a lot of things. So here are some of the things that it could or could not encompass. One is educational programs arguing for a Christian founding, right? The view that the founders explicitly set out to establish a Christian republic. Again, there are lots of people who believe this today. Broad campaigns to pass quote unquote biblical laws and place Christian symbols in public. So this is probably the most extreme manifestation of Christian nationalism, which is the pursuit of dominion, which is rule by conservative Christians only. So again, there's some people on the extreme religious right who think that America should only be run by conservative Christians, which again, this is why I say Christian nationalism is a spectrum. There are lots of people who say, yeah, God and the United States have a special relationship, who would view this and be like, oh, no, I don't want that, right? This is a democracy. We're not a theocracy. So again, it's a spectrum of belief. Some people today will look at, things like dominionism and use terms like extreme Christian nationalism. So this is what it means. Christian nationalism becomes extreme when people violate democratic norms, demonize non-believers, and or use violence in pursuit of establishing a Christian nation. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that doesn't happen. I mean, people like Christians aren't using violence to try to make America a Christian nation. Well, most are not, certainly, but some are. For example, on January 6, 2021, thousands of Trump supporters came to Washington, D.C. to stop the certification of the election because they believed it was stolen. Some commentators have pointed out, and I think they're right, that a significant plurality, maybe even a vast majority of the people who are participating in this were doing so because of their religious beliefs, because they believe that America is a Christian nation, that the people who were stealing the election were basically trying to steal the election from good, honest, white, conservative Christian people. And some of the people who entered the Capitol, vowing to kill Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Mike Pence were doing so because they thought that God was on their side. So again, these are kind of fringe beliefs, but they're fringe beliefs that are probably a lot more dominant in American society than you realize. However, we're not there yet. And before we start talking about things happening now, we need to go back, way back again, to the time kind of before and during the Revolution, and look at some things happening in American Christianity that were really influential and important. So, first of all, between the Revolution and the Civil War, all states with tax-supported churches dissolved their religious establishment. So again, the First Amendment said the federal government cannot have a federal church, but states can have their own churches. A bunch of states did, but by the time we get to the Civil War, they were like, nah, it's not a good idea, and they had dissolved them. And in light of that, this was happening kind of at the same time. The individualistic spirit of America, plus the lack of state-church interference, created a fertile environment for new religious expression. So basically, what am I saying? There are lots of new religious movements that just happened in the years between, the 1600s and the Civil War. For example, here are a few of them. The following faiths emerged during this era. So again, this is a very, very broad era, early 1700s through the 1850s. So for example, the Black Church pretty much appears at this time, right? There are various Black churches that emerge, probably the most famous and most influential to this day being the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which again, you can look up if you want to learn more about. Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, right? They kind of appear at this time as well. The Adventist, the Seventh-day Adventists, what some people know them as today, the Spiritualists. So what is that? Well, you can Google it. There's this really, think of like, mediums, people contacting the dead, psychics. That really becomes an important movement in the years, especially the years kind of before and after the Civil War. There are also various apocalyptic sects, right? So an apocalyptic sect is a Christian group who thinks that the end was near. And there are various movements to say that, the world's going to end in 18 whatever. And of course it didn't. But these were influential movements nonetheless. Also, the Baptists and the Methodists did not appear during this era, but in the early 1800s, they were pretty small and not very influential groups, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Why? Well, because of evangelism, right? Because part of the movement that we're going to look at very shortly is that Americans are becoming more and more evangelistic, and Christianity is becoming more and more evangelistic, right? So instead of like, yeah, I'm just born into Catholicism, I'm a Catholic, it's like, no, you have to choose to become a Christian. You have to convert. You have to have a conversion experience. And again, these ideas would become central to American Christianity. So let's keep going and look how those played out. So there's something known as the First Great Awakenings. There's kind of three Great Awakenings. We're going to look at two of them. The First Great Awakening, again, roughly 1730 to 1770, was a religious revival preaching that people must be born again. What does that mean? Well, it means people had to turn from their sins and accept Jesus as Savior. So again, nobody was saying this, like during the 1400s or whatever, right? It was just like you were born into the society where Catholicism was it, and you like did these rituals and these practices, and then if you did them, you went to heaven, right? So this was a pretty radical reinterpretation of kind of historic Christian beliefs. So in this developing understanding of what it meant to be a Christian, you basically had to make a personal decision, right? And converts were expected to develop a personal relationship with God. This marks the birth of modern evangelicalism. And again, this is like a break from where Christianity had been for basically centuries. The idea of having like a personal relationship with God was not necessarily part of like historic Catholicism, right? It was like you were born into this culture, you were naturally a Catholic because that was it. And you would attend church and do these rituals, and that would kind of mark you as saved by God, right? So this was kind of a new understanding. If you go on the internet and just Google, personal walk with God or daily walk with God or whatever, you'll find all kinds of memes and websites and kind of study tools for Christians to develop their walk with God by reading the Bible and praying every day. This was not an idea, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This was not an idea that the average Christian person had, especially since for centuries, right? The Bible was not available to everyday people. Well, this starts to change, and kind of the particular flavor of kind of evangelical Christianity that we have today was really like developed during this era, right? Again, this idea, this almost like kind of like hyper individualistic idea that I'm responsible to develop my one-on-one personal relationship with God. So the First Great Awakening happened at these large outdoor, again, they call them revivals, right? There would be a preacher or maybe a series of preachers who would kind of advertise, hey, I'm going to be doing this for so many days at this particular place. And, thousands and thousands of people were showing up, and thousands of people all across America were converting to this new kind of evangelical understanding of Christianity. Probably the most famous, maybe even infamous, First Great Awakening preacher was Jonathan Edwards. He was a very influential and famous Puritan pastor and preacher whose probably most famous sermon is "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." I know a lot of like high school students read this in like, English literature class, which I did in high school. I don't know if you did. Now, whether you know about this sermon or not, I'm going to play a little chunk of it just to give you an idea of the fervor and intensity of some of the preaching.
Isaiah 66 verses 23 and 24 says, "From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. And they shall go forth, and look upon the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me. For their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all. It is an everlasting wrath. It would be dreadful to suffer this fierceness and wrath of Almighty God for even one moment, but you will suffer it for all eternity. There will be no end to this intense and horrible misery. When you look ahead, you will see along forever, an unlimited length of time before you. This will swallow up all of your thoughts. It will amaze your soul, and you will be in absolute despair of ever being delivered, of its ever coming to an end, or of receiving any reduction of torment or any rest at all. You will know for sure that you must wear out many long ages, millions and millions of ages in struggling and fighting against this merciless vengeance. When you have struggled and fought through all these many ages, you will realize that hardly a second has gone by.
And, there are lots of reports from this era of people, just like weeping and, screaming for God to save them and like falling out and, like very like dramatic and emotional responses to what for a lot of people was this very, very persuasive evangelical message. So a few years after the Constitution is ratified, you have what some historic. So a few years after the Constitution is ratified, you have like a second round of this, right? So the Second Great Awakening is a second wave of evangelical revivalism. It ushered in a much more emotional and personal form of spirituality that still characterizes American Christianity today. So again, the seeds have been planted in the First Great Awakening. By the time we get to the Second Great Awakening, this very like uniquely form of American Christianity, where again, it's almost like it's almost kind of like hyper individualistic, right? Where it's like you have this walk with God, right? You have this personal kind of one-on-one relationship, and it's up to you to develop it, right? Just like if you're married to someone, it's up to you to develop that relationship and maintain that. Same thing with you and God, right? So the Second Great Awakening also created some of the new denominations in faith, which we looked at a few slides back, so I won't rehash that. Again, the Second Great Awakening was kind of a sequel. A lot of very passionate outdoor preaching, just like we had during the First Great Awakening.
Beginning in the 1790s, the ideals that fueled the American Revolution also spurred the Second Great Awakening. This evangelical religious movement and its beliefs, which were dedicated to equality and free will, greatly influenced the first half of the 19th century. While Calvinists believed God preordained the saved and the damned, evangelicals believed that humans could turn from sin and determine their own salvation. Evangelical leaders also argued that anyone who could read the Bible could understand its messages. A person's devotion to evangelism was for the masses, not just the elite. Evangelists connected religion to the United States' success. They determined to strengthen the country by converting vast numbers of people, often at large gatherings called camp meetings attended by hundreds, even thousands of people, which lasted for several days. Charismatic evangelists preached the gospel to these huge audiences in massive tents and open fields. Camp included singing hymns and dramatic confessions, but the highlight was a rebirth, or transformation of one's religious identity. The movement's intensity promoted the rapid growth of several Protestant denominations and led to the establishment of black churches. Slave owners had feared that baptizing slaves would mean freeing them, but they shifted under the influence of the awakening, convinced that Christianized slaves would become better workers. Enslaved and free, African Americans found hope in the evangelical message. Thousands converted to Christianity. Those who followed the Methodist and Baptist traditions eventually formed their own version of Christianity that also drew upon Western and Central African cultures.
Now, there's a lot we could say about both the First and the Second Great Awakening. However, for our purposes today, we're interested in this question, right? How did the kind of religious fervor of the era lead to this idea that America was specially blessed by God? Well, here's a few points. So after the Revolution, the Second Great Awakening fueled a national embrace of evangelical faith. We already talked about that. Millions came to basically believe that America was a Christian nation, right? Regardless of what the founders thought or said. If people believe it, it doesn't really matter what the founders thought. And just more and more and more people, people of various Christian sects and denominations were starting to believe this. And there are at least three senses of this idea. So again, three senses at that time. Sense number one was, kind of coming straight from the founders and the Enlightenment. God's providence proved that he had a special mission for America, right? And just to kind of connect the then to the now, here are various memes that I found online kind of capturing contemporary iterations of this belief. Apostle Natasha Gerbich, who was some random person I found on Facebook, had this meme on her social media page, right? Kind of arguing that, God has a special plan for America. Yeah, sure, God has a plan for the whole world, but God's plan for America is particularly unique, right? America has a special relationship with God that no other country on the planet has. And there are also like popular writers, right? Michael Medved, who's a conservative, influential conservative writer, New York Times bestselling author, put a book out a few years ago called God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era. So again, these beliefs that are kind of bubbling up in the years after the Revolution are still very much with us. Sense number two of the belief at that time was that the founders were devout believers who created a nation reflecting their faith. Now, again, I don't think this is true. I don't think the founders would have thought this was true, but we're talking like, at this point, we're kind of talking like late 1700s, early 1800s, like, right? A lot of the founders were like aging. Some of them had been president or whatever. And we're getting further and further away from the founding generation. And a lot of people in the kind of decades after the founding era just started to believe that the founders were devout Christians and started telling other people this and kind of making this argument. And here we are today. There's still millions of people who believe this. For example, probably most of you have not heard of this guy, David Barton. He's actually a really, really, really influential thinker and writer on the kind of Christian right. He, for decades, has been putting out a series of books and eventually videos, DVDs, and today online, basically arguing that the founders were pretty much all Christians. Even some of the founders like Thomas Jefferson, who didn't have Orthodox beliefs, still had like broadly Christian beliefs. And furthermore, that people like myself, historians and secularists or whatever, are trying to hide these facts from the public, right? And there's this whole kind of industry of people, again, putting out videos, books, people who get paid thousands of dollars to come and speak at mega churches, basically, quote unquote, educating Christians on their Christian heritage that people are trying to hide from them. So this is an old belief that is still very much around today. Point number 3, in terms of what early Americans believed about their relationship between the United States and God, was that the governmental ideas and documents of the founding were based on Christian and/or biblical principles. Now, again, there's almost no support for this belief when you actually look at the evidence, but then and now a lot of people believed it. So let's look at some contemporary examples. For example, there's a group called Capital Ministries, like a Christian nonprofit that, I guess ministers to members of Congress. From their, I found this like Bible study on their website, basically arguing this. So Trinity is a Christian belief that God has 3 persons, basically Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And according to this, the founders got the idea of the 3 branches of government from the Trinity, right? Trinity, a condition of threeness. Christians are monotheistic Trinitarians, believing God is one in essence, but 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Did you know that our founders separated government into 3 different branches, in part in reflection of God's threefold governmental nature? I'm sorry, this is patently absurd. Like, there's just no evidence. Like, no one, like, there's no writings from the founders that are arguing this, right? This is just using, evidence and putting things together that in the minds of the person writing this makes sense, but the actual evidence doesn't support this view. Here's another example: the National Center for Constitutional Studies, again, another kind of Christian organization arguing for these things. Biblical roots of the Declaration of Independence. So we have a quote here from the Declaration of Independence, and then we have some Bible verses, which again, the founders were not reading the Bible and writing the founding documents right after they read the Bible. This is just patently false. However, these patently false ideas are really powerful for people decades after the revolution as they are now.
The U.S. Constitution, written and signed by our founding fathers, sits here in the National Archives. These founders saw themselves as men of faith and used what they learned in God's Word to help them form their new nation's law and government.
So I like to say, it's not that we established a Christian country, but without Christian values, we would never establish this kind of country. We're shaped by the Bible.
Outside the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, historian Peter Lillback showed me phrase by phrase how the preamble of the Constitution reflects these biblical values.
It begins by saying, we the people of the United States come together to make a more perfect union. They want to be one. They know they can't be perfect. That's a biblical idea. We're trying to get better. We can progress.
Then establish justice. Lillback quotes Micah 6:8.
The Lord has shown you what he requires of you, O man, that you would do justice and love mercy. Justice is a biblical concern.
Ensure domestic tranquility.
Paul will say in Romans chapter 12, as much as lies within me, I will live at peace with all men.
Provide for the common defense.
So we know that one of the great principles of God's law is to defend the orphan and the widow.
Promote the general welfare.
We should do good to all men, especially to those of the household of faith.
And secure the blessings of liberty.
I always like to say that the word blessing is a word you don't hear atheists using. The very nature of blessing is something that's being given to us from God. And liberty is something that God has blessed us with.
And then the Constitution lays out our legislative and judicial and executive branches of government. And all 3 reflect different aspects of God himself that are shown in the Bible.
So for our final section, we're going to be putting some of these things together. So yeah, the early, period after the revolution was hundreds of years ago, and we're in a different place now, but these ideas have persisted and have morphed into a very, very particular kind of character and tenor that I want to look at for the rest of the time. So I'm calling this last section, the religious right and modern Christian nationalism. So let's jump in and continue the story. And again, remind you of this, right? We started out by looking at two sort of recent-ish case studies, right? One is reactions, kind of Christian conservative reactions to 9/11, and then the Hobby Lobby decision, right? Both of which I would say were being fueled by these kind of Christian nationalist beliefs. And a lot of it stems from this. Today, a lot of political commentators will point out that kind of conservative evangelicals, particularly conservative white evangelicals, are kind of like a voting bloc, right? So in other words, they tend to vote for similar candidates. They tend to support similar causes. However, this whole idea of conservative evangelicals being a voting bloc is a really, really kind of new phenomenon. And I think what I'm going to do in this next section is kind of pair this whole narrative of Christian nationalism with an exploration of where kind of the modern religious right came from, because again, they didn't always exist, and now they're huge and powerful and important in American politics. So how did all that happen? I think the best way to jump into this is to begin with some kind of general observations about religious life in the early 20th century. So again, early 20th century being early 1900s, and this is showing membership in religious organizations. Notice how low it is in the early 1900s. Roughly like right above 40%. You notice the number goes up and up and up and up as we get into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and kind of goes down a little bit, but then goes up even more in the 1980s and 90s. Here's some more data capturing this. So Gallup, which is a kind of opinion polling agency for decades, has been asking people, did you attend a religious service in the past week? And look at these numbers. Again, pretty low in the early 1930s, and then all of a sudden in the late 1940s, early 1950s, things skyrocket. Things go down again a bit as the 60s are playing out. But this is a really important question. Why was there a dramatic increase after 1950? And the answer to that question should help us understand the state of religious identity in US politics today. So let's jump in. And just some quick refresher about things we've already looked at. World War II happened. And after World War II, the Cold War happened. I'm not going to rehash the Cold War. So we've already looked at this, but what I didn't really mention when we were talking about this is the important role that Christianity played in kind of American identity during the Cold War. And I think a good way to explore this is to talk about Dwight Eisenhower, who was one of the most important kind of mid-20th century presidents. And let's look at the role he played in this story. So Dwight, also known as Ike Eisenhower, served 2 presidential terms, 53 to 61, and set the cultural tone for the Cold War. So he was pretty much he pretty much was the president during the most important era of the Cold War. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was a former U.S. Army general who, was really important during World War II, and after World War II wrapped up, parlayed that into a political career, and was president for 2 terms. So he did a pretty good job of doing that. Now, Eisenhower himself was not very devout, meaning he didn't really go to church regularly. He didn't read the Bible and pray very often, right? However, he was very aware of and keyed into this kind of civil religion tradition that, again, the founders had kind of permitted and encouraged in some cases, and have been around for decades and decades since then. And he really kind of updated this concept for the Cold War era, persuasively combining patriotism and religious rhetoric with anti-communism. So patriotism, Americanness, Christianity, or not Christianity specifically, but just religion, right? Religious fervor. All these things are really getting put together for Eisenhower during this era. And just some backdrop. So, communism, again, we're fighting Russia, right? We're fighting communism, which is a political and economic system. But in the minds of a lot of people back then, it was also a religious system, right? Well, why? Well, here's a quote from Karl Marx, who's again, kind of the founder of modern communism, who believed that the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness, right? So in other words, if you really want people to be happy, you need to get rid of religion. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. It's a little circular, but basically saying this. The criticism of religion is, therefore, in embryo, the criticism of the veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Wow, I want you to really feel. So in other words, he basically thought religions were all stupid and idiotic and just lies to kind of keep the working classes down, right? So again, this is the founder of communism. So there was this dominant idea, which was not completely inaccurate, that communism was a kind of godless, anti-religious system. So here's just, again, a Cold War era comic book, which there's lots of these. Comic books at that time were one of the ways that a lot of Cold War ideas were taught to children. And there was the dominant idea that resisting communism was not just about resisting this political or economic system we didn't like. It was also about resisting atheism and kind of the forces of godlessness in the world, right? So this was a really, really powerful rhetoric and narrative at the time. And Eisenhower cemented this through various ways by, for example, basically making friends with famous Christian evangelists. So this guy on the left here is Billy Graham. He's been dead for a while. His son's still around and active, although not as influential as his dad. But Billy Graham was I think, other than Martin Luther King Jr., the most important kind of Christian figure of the 20th century. He kind of oversaw like another revival during the Cold War, which we're going to talk about. But Eisenhower was aware of the importance of Billy Graham, was aware of how important Christianity was in fighting the Cold War, and was one of the first presidents to kind of reach out to famous and influential faith leaders like Billy Graham and kind of like enlist him in fighting the Cold War. So here's a rundown of some quotes from Eisenhower, which I think are really interesting and illustrative of some of the things I'm going to talk about. Without God, there would be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. Recognition of the supreme being is the most basic expression of Americanism. Thus, the founders saw it, and thus, with God's help, it will continue to be. This is actually, I think, a pretty accurate interpretation of the founders' ideas. Again, whether you agree with them or not is fine, but this is, again, him updating these old ideas for the 1950s. The churches of America are citadels of our faith in individual freedom and human dignity. This faith is the living source of all spiritual strength, and this strength is our matchless armor in our worldwide struggle against the forces of godless tyranny and oppression. He's talking about communism, right? I think indirectly. But again, I think this is a good example of Eisenhower wedding this kind of patriotic, anti-communist Cold War language with kind of Christian ideals. However, Eisenhower's beliefs are really complicated, and I think this next quote really captures this. In other words, our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. So again, he was very in line with the founders in this way. The founders thought virtue was important. Because virtue was important, religion's important, and we're this kind of steeped in Western Christianity, so that's what we're promoting. But and there's some quotes from the founders that really kind of say this as well, that some of the founders thought other religious systems were just fine, right? As long as you had a religion, you were fine. It didn't have to be Christianity. And again, Eisenhower believed that as well. And I think as further evidence of that, in 1957, Eisenhower was the first U.S. president to visit a mosque. So at that time, a new mosque had opened up in D.C., which, then and now, a lot of people are unhappy when this happens. But Eisenhower was not one of them. He thought, hey, as long as you have a religion, that's cool. And this is evidence of that, which, I think surprises a lot of people, that this kind of, ostensibly Christian president was okay with other religions, which feels weird today, but 1950s were a different time. So kind of building on that point, Ike was not a Christian nationalist, right? However, Christian nationalists loved him, right? Because like the founders, he made these very ambiguous statements that you could interpret in a lot of ways. And a lot of people during this era who thought America was a uniquely Christian nation really glommed onto some of the things Eisenhower said and really kind of took them and ran with them. And not surprisingly, his presidency coincided with skyrocketing church attendance rates, increased political clout amongst religious conservatives, and a push for various levels of government to adopt overtly Christian symbols. This last point is super important. There's a lot of kind of like Christianish symbolism that is part of American life today that actually comes from the 1950s. It doesn't come from like hundreds of years of tradition. So let me just give you some very specific examples of what I'm talking about. And I think the best way to do that is to kind of set this up as, if you were a conservative, particularly white conservative Christian nationalist in the 1950s, there were some things that happened that you were really excited about, right? On the left side, victories, some things that happened that you were not excited about, some setbacks. So, and the reason I'm doing this again is I think this is setting the table for some of the debates we're having today. So what were some of the victories? Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So a lot of people are really surprised to hear this, but if you grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools, you probably said one nation under God. That's a really recent addition, 1954. Well, why? Well, again, the Cold War fervor, this kind of reinvigorated Christian nationalism is kind of pushing Congress to do things like this, add under God to the National Pledge of Allegiance. In God We Trust replaces E Pluribus Unum, which means out of many one, as the motto of the U.S. So the United States actually didn't have a motto. E Pluribus Unum had been the kind of unofficial motto for like decades and decades and decades. However, in 1955, Congress, in this kind of response to this religious nationalist fervor, says, okay, officially, in God we trust is our motto. But again, this is relatively new. So that's why, to this day, one nation under God, part of the pledge, in God we trust is on our money. Well, this money was printed after 1955. Money printed before doesn't have this because this is a relatively recent invention. Another victory, displays of the Ten Commandments appear in courthouses nationwide. So the Ten Commandments are a section of the ancient Hebrew Bible where, basically in the story, God says these are like these are 10 most important things that I want you to do. And this is real history. I'm not making this up. In 1956, there was a huge Hollywood movie called The Ten Commandments, which was hugely successful and influential across the country. And in order to promote it, the film company who produced this started basically giving away Ten Commandment sculptures to various state houses and courthouses all across the country to promote the movie. So here's Charlton Heston, the guy who played Moses in the movie. And that is why that for decades all across America, there were 10 Commandments kind of displays or statues or plaques or whatever at courthouses. Now, then and now, people would say, well, the reason why we have these in some courthouses is because, the founders built a lot of basic principles in the Constitution on the law of God revealed in the Bible, which is not true. And I think this is evidence of that. This is a really recent addition. And, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a bunch of court cases where various civil liberties organizations were hey, you have to take these down. These violate, church state separation. And, that's a long story that you can look up later on. But the point is this, that regardless of your opinion of whether courthouses should have the Ten Commandments, on a wall or whatever, this is a really recent movement. And it comes directly from kind of this Cold War era where people are kind of developing our modern understanding of Christian nationalism. Okay, fourth huge victory was Protestant Christian schools explode around the country, providing religious education for millions of students. So there's a long tradition of Catholic schools, which exist for a completely different reason that we're going to get into more when we talk about immigration. However, so I went to a Christian school. I know a lot of my students that I've met over the years have gone to Christian schools, Christian school all the way through high school. And most of these Christian schools were founded during this era, particularly in the 1970s, for reasons I'm going to talk about shortly. So let's get to the setbacks now. One of those setbacks was in the 1950s, some people tried to get a Christian amendment added to the Constitution, and it just kept failing. Congress just kept refusing to pass it. Here is some text from the 1954 proposed Christian amendment to the Constitution. It had 3 sections. Section 1, this nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God. Section 2, this amendment shall not be interpreted so as to result in the establishment of any particular ecclesiastical organization. So in other words, we're not saying that the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Catholics, that their particular understanding of God or Jesus, right, it's broad, right? Or in the abridgment of the rights of religious freedom or freedom of speech and press or of peaceful assemblage. Section 3, Congress shall have power in such cases as it may deem proper to provide a suitable oath or affirmation for citizens whose religious scruples prevent them from giving unqualified allegiance to the Constitution as herein amended. So in other words, mostly pretty much exclusively white Christians in Congress were trying to get this added to the Constitution, basically saying yes, America is a Christian nation and it's now in our founding documents. They kept failing, right? And there's been various attempts since then that have all failed. So again, if you're a Christian nationalist, these are things you're not happy about in the 1950s. Also, you're not happy about Brown versus Board of Education, right? Well, why? Well, because unfortunately, this is where Christian schools come from. And again, this is part of our history. I'm not just making this up. There's lots of people who have documented this. The huge proliferation of Christian schools in the 1970s and also 1980s, but mostly 1970s, are a direct result of kind of desegregation efforts. 70s, 1954, right? There seems like there's a gap here. Well, yeah. Basically, Brown versus Board of Education has been around for a long time, and the federal government, the Supreme Court, pretty much didn't really enforce it for a while until we get to the late 1960s, early 1970s. And as the government is telling school districts, hey, you can't be segregated anymore, some Christians are like, okay, we'll start our own schools, and that's really where the modern Christian school movement comes from. So again, Christian schools in the 1970s and 80s as well were founded for a lot of reasons. To this day, a lot of Christian parents don't like how public schools handle evolution or gender issues or race or whatever. So lots of reasons why people send their kids to Christian schools. However, initially race was probably the most important motivating factor, right? And again, Christian schools from this era are all majority white. Why? Well, because that's largely why they were formed. And some critics at that time refer to these institutions as segregation academies, right? So, for example, here is a advertisement for a private school from the early 1970s for a school, and I think this is North or South Carolina, I can't remember. And Stonewall Jackson Academy. Now, I don't know if this is a Christian school or not. Based on my research, I couldn't find out that much details about this school. I don't know if it exists anymore or not. But again, just the name, Stonewall Jackson Academy. Stonewall Jackson was like a Southern Confederate Civil War general. So they're kind of like dog whistling, I guess, that like, hey, we're going to protect white supremacy. Come to this school. And again, somewhat just to tie this into previous things we've talked about, this whole kind of history of miscegenation and being terrified of interracial sexual mixing. This was also a motivator for starting Christian schools, right? I don't want my beautiful blonde white daughter going to school with a black kid where she might fall in love with him and want to date him, and God forbid, right? So let's pull our kids out and we'll give them the instruction that these increasingly secularizing public schools, the public schools have gotten rid of, we're going to talk about, also gotten rid of prayer and Bible reading. So this is also, all of this is kind of fueling this movement to create a Christian school kind of like alternative for people who don't want public schools for their Christian kids anymore. So let me just put these up together, actually. There's also two Supreme Court rulings that infuriated Christians, which again, further encouraged them to look to alternative means to educate their kids. One was Engel versus Vitale, which rules public school prayer is unconstitutional. The next year, Abingdon versus Schempp rules devotional public school Bible reading is unconstitutional, right? So for decades, depending on what state you were in, because different states have different laws, your day might open up. Your public school day might open up with your teacher leading you in a very general prayer and maybe a reading of some passages of scriptures. And in the early 60s, the Supreme Court says, nope, not going to do that anymore. And this infuriated a lot of people then and now. I'm going to play a little video just about one of those decisions so you can kind of get a sense of what it was about.
So as always, let's begin with the facts of the case. This case came before the court in 1962, and before that time, the New York Board of Regents had composed a non-denominational prayer to be recited by school children after saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And the prayer, just 22 words in length, went something like this. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Now, as far as prayers go, that one's pretty vague. Like, ain't nobody invoking Jesus or Allah in that prayer. And what's more, children could opt out of that prayer with written permission from their parents. Even so, a group of parents led by Stephen Engel challenged the practice. And why did they do that? Well, for that, let's consider the constitutional principle at stake. For Engel and his crew, this prayer was a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which, in case you forgot, says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, if you're paying attention, and I know that you are, you might be saying, wait, what? Congress isn't even involved here. This was a New York state law, so how could Engel claim that this law was violating his First Amendment rights, which protect citizens from the federal government? And if that's your question, then let me hasten to remind you of the 14th Amendment, which says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. So the 14th Amendment essentially applies the First Amendment to the states as well as to the federal government. But don't get confused by all the amendments. At the end of the day, this is a case about the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Okay, so what was the decision? Well, the question that the court considered was this: does the reading of a state-sponsored prayer at the beginning of school violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? And their answer in a 6-1 decision was yes. The prayer did in fact violate the First Amendment. And it was Justice Hugo Black who wrote the majority opinion, and in it he said, the First Amendment was added to the Constitution to stand as a guarantee that neither the power nor the prestige of the federal government would be used to control, support, or influence the kinds of prayer the American people can say. Now, Justice Potter Stewart was the one justice who dissented, and his reasoning was that the practice of school prayer was constitutional because it gave children, quote, the opportunity of sharing in the spiritual heritage of our nation. Additionally, Stewart argued that the government isn't establishing a religion just by offering a prayer for those who want to pray it. However, it was Thomas Jefferson's famous wall of separation between church and state that won the day in this case.
So final point here is the 1960s happened. So we've already talked about that at length. I'm not going to rehash it, but if you are a conservative religious person, if you're watching all these things happen, you're going to feel like your culture and your heritage and your nation and your understanding of what your nation is, which is a white Christian nation, you're going to be upset about these things. And that's going to kind of eventually, maybe, encourage you to get politically active. And that's kind of the next part we're going to talk about. In 1973, right, the Supreme Court, as we've already talked about briefly when we talked about kind of the feminist movement, in 1973, Supreme Court passes a very consequential decision, which essentially legalized abortion nationwide. And that really was the catalyzing moment that encouraged a lot of conservative Christians to get involved politically. That is not what happened. This is the popular narrative. Today, if you talk to a lot of conservative Christians, or if you just like look up articles online, the popular narrative is conservative Christians kind of suffered through the 60s and were silent. And, then Nixon came along, kind of gave them a voice, but they really got active in politics. And kind of the modern religious right really appears at this time after Roe versus Wade happened and all these Christians were angry about it. That is not what happened. That is actually patently false and against what the actual historical record says.
Now, my previous statement might have confused you, and it is true that abortion plays a really important role in this larger story of kind of the creation or the emergence of the Christian right or the religious right in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But before getting into that, I just want to make a side point. Some of you are going to disagree with this side point. But I'll say two things. One, this is not a personal opinion of mine. This is a historical opinion based on my reading of the historical data. And secondly, if you disagree with me and think I'm just way off base and anything I said is inappropriate, like I really want to hear from you. I mean, I legitimately want to hear from students when I say things that they disagree with or think are unfair. And I would say you owe it to yourself and future students because if there's something I'm legitimately doing or saying that needs to be corrected, I can't know that if someone doesn't tell it to me. So having said that, let me make a few points about abortion belief and the Bible. Watching this are anti-abortion for religious reasons. That's understandable. There are clear reasons for someone with a religious worldview to oppose abortion, right? So some of you watching this feel very strongly about abortion, either for or against it. If religion plays into those, that's fine by me. I'm not at all trying to change anyone's opinion one way or the other about abortion. However, if you believe the Bible teaches an anti-abortion stance, I think the biblical record does not support this. And again, I'll explain why I'm saying this. Let me finish making the points, and then I'll explain why I think this is an important point to make. Nowhere in the Hebrew or Christian scriptures is abortion directly mentioned. So again, if you use the dictionary definition of abortion, which is the intentional ending of a pregnancy, that does not appear anywhere in the Bible. And again, if you disagree with me, email me. You can send me some Bible verses. I've read all the Bible verses that Christians present. It is, I think, just a fact that abortion does not appear in the Bible, either in the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament, as Christians call it, or the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. In fact, only one biblical passage deals with the loss of a fetus, which is Exodus 21, 22, 25. You can look it up if you want. And it does not give fetal life the same value as a fully birthed human. So again, I'm not trying to argue a position. I think I'm just being factual. And you can look that verse up. Let me give you a quick summary in case you're curious. If you're not curious, you can just skip forward a minute. Basically, the ancient Israelites were a tribal society, and they had a tribal law code, which is contained in various sections of the first 5 books of the ancient Hebrew scriptures, also known as the Old Testament, according to Christians. There's a section in which the question is kind of asked, if 2 men are fighting and one man accidentally hits a pregnant woman and she miscarries, what should the penalty be for that man? It says that the man who caused the miscarriage should be fined. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if you read through the ancient Israelite law code, and again, most Christians don't even because it feels very old and not very relevant to us. There's a lot of sections where, people are assigned the death penalty for doing things like murder and sexual assault and things like that. And the fact that the offender here is fined signals that it's not given the same weight as the loss of human life. Now, I want to say that sometimes people on the left use this Bible verse to say, oh, the Bible is pro-abortion. No, that's not true either. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're anti-abortion and you're a religious person, I'm fine with that. I'm not trying to change your views or attack your views or say you're wrong. What I am saying is that when Christians say the Bible teaches against abortion, it's just factually not true. It's just not in there. And again, if you disagree with me, email me and we'll have a conversation offline. One more super quick point, and we will get back to the history. The reason this is all important is because the story of how kind of the masses of American Christians came to believe that abortion was kind of like the hill to die on, like the most important issue for American Christians, and that the Bible taught that, right? The question that how did they come to believe that, and the question of where do we get the religious right from are deeply intertwined, which is why I kind of had to pause and explain that before we get back to it.
So again, to kind of reiterate things I already said, conservative evangelicals were not an organized voting bloc in the early 1970s, nor were they strongly anti-abortion. In fact, most conservative Christians, again, Protestant Christians we're talking about, most Protestants at the time kind of didn't really care about abortion. Catholics had believed that abortion was wrong for a long time. And for a lot of conservative Protestants, it was like, what's a Catholic issue? Like, what do we care, right? And again, here's just some evidence of that, just so you know I'm not making this up. So there's a magazine called Christianity Today, which I think started in the 50s. And it's less influential now, but at that time was a really influential magazine in kind of conservative evangelical thought. And here is just some evidence that, you know, something as like powerful and influential as Christianity Today had really complicated views on abortion. Two successive editors of Christianity Today took equivocal stances. Equivocal meaning kind of like in the middle. On abortion. Carl F.H. Henry, the magazine's founder, affirmed that a woman's body is not the domain and property of others. And his successor, Harold Lindsell, allowed that if there are compelling psychiatric reasons from a Christian point of view, mercy and prudence may favor a therapeutic abortion. Here's just more evidence of that. Meeting in St. Louis in 1971, the messengers or delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention. Let me pause there. So there's like these large like denominations in America, right? Southern Baptist Convention is a particular form of kind of Baptist Christianity. To this day, I believe it's one of the biggest denominations in America. And denominations will often meet, you know, once a year for like national meetings to talk about, you know, theology or church structure or governance or whatever. So in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention is having a meeting in St. Louis. The Southern Baptists, let me pick up here, to the Southern Baptist Convention, hardly a redoubt of liberalism. In other words, Southern Baptists are known then and now as being like really socially and politically conservative. However, in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. What? A position they reaffirmed in 1974, a year after Roe, and again in 1976. So again, like the evidence just doesn't support this narrative that like abortion happened, conservative Christians were angry, and then they got politically active. That's not what happened. So here's what did happen.
This is the story of the man who helped turn conservative evangelicals into a political force.
I want to talk a little bit about how much our family respects and admires Paul Weyrich.
I want to be like Paul Weyrich when I grow up.
Paul Weyrich has been called the main architect of the religious right. Here he is in 2005.
Those people were not active in politics, and I served as sort of a coach to get them active in the political process.
He also co-founded conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Free Congress Foundation. And he managed to galvanize the evangelical vote around a man who wasn't even an evangelical.
God bless America.
Does that feel familiar? Because a similar thing happened in 2016 with the election of President Donald Trump.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ball game. Is that the one? Is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like because I loved it.
Hey fam, I'm Imayan, and this Sunday we're going to look at the man behind the evangelical political movement and how it wasn't abortion that created the religious right in the United States. You might have been told that the movement began with Roe v. Wade, but according to Randall Balmer, a religious historian, it actually began with Paul Weyrich.
One of the most cherished myths of the religious right is that this is a movement that got its origins in reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision. It's a great story. It's been repeated many, many times. It is also utter fiction.
It was Weyrich's calculated effort that made the religious right a political force, and his plan took years to complete.
Conservatives were wandering around lost in the liberal wilderness, and then Paul Weyrich came to Washington.
When Weyrich arrived in Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s, he was to the right of more liberal Republicans, which made him a minority within his own party. Back then, the worlds of religion and politics were largely separate. But Weyrich was determined to change that by courting white evangelicals. The group had retreated from politics after the so-called Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which really centered around teaching evolution in schools. Not only did white evangelicals lose, but they also were humiliated in the public eye.
Paul Weyrich, according to his own account, had been trying since the 1964 presidential campaign to get evangelicals active in politics. He tried everything. He said he tried the school prayer issue, he tried the abortion issue, he tried pornography.
In the end, Weyrich landed on school segregation in the South.
Some carried a doll in a miniature coffin, an effigy of federal Judge Skelly Wright, who ordered the admission of 5 Negro girls to formally worst grades in New Orleans last week.
And I have to give you a little bit of a backstory first, so please stay with me. In 1970, public schools in 7 states were racially segregated. This was over a decade and a half after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled segregated schools were unconstitutional with its Brown versus Board of Education decision. And Mississippi was one of the states fighting hardest against integration. State leaders claimed that their freedom of choice system allowed black children to attend white schools. In reality, black families were subject to intimidation if they tried to enroll. And some white families were so opposed to integration that they abandoned public schools altogether. In Holmes County, Mississippi, there were no white students left in the public school system after just 2 years of desegregation. So where were they all going? Well, between 1966 and 1970, the percentage of private schools in the state rose, and the number of students attending those schools tripled. Most of this growth occurred in black majority districts.
There were segregation academies, church-sponsored, that were applying for tax-exempt status.
Then in 1969, a group of African American parents in Holmes County sued the Treasury Department to prevent 3 new segregation academies from getting that tax-exempt status, and they won.
The court ruled that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution.
The following year, President Richard Nixon ordered the IRS to enact new policy denying exemptions to all segregated schools. In 1971, the Green v. Connolly District Court case ruling upheld the new IRS policy, and evangelical leaders didn't like it, which is where Paul Weyrich re-enters our story.
Paul Weyrich finally found the issue that would get the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, Bob Jones Jr. of Bob Jones University, and a broader array of evangelical leaders.
Weyrich and Falwell managed to shift the grounds of the debate. They turned it into a conversation about government interference and religious freedom instead of what it really was, a defense of racist policies. They used the issue to attack Democratic President and evangelical Jimmy Carter, even though it was Republican President Richard Nixon who came down hard on segregation academies. Bob Jones University lost its tax exemption status a year and a day before Carter was inaugurated. So Weyrich had figured out how to win over evangelical leaders. But to win elections, he still needed an issue to get grassroots evangelical voters to the polls. He realized that defending racial discrimination might not be it. Now this is where the abortion debate comes in. Here's Falwell in 1982. But pause. Balmer says evangelical leaders didn't pursue abortion as an issue right away.
Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach against abortion until February of 1978, more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. The key moment for abortion comes in the 1978 midterm elections. Weyrich then resolved that he would go out and elect some improbable people.
Weyrich threw all his effort into getting anti-abortion Republican candidates elected in Minnesota and Iowa.
The final weekend of the campaign, pro-lifers leafleted church parking lots, and 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 Democratic nominees lost to pro-life Republicans.
Okay, so here's what really happened. Here's the real story. And again, as usual, unfortunately, it comes down to race. So what happened? The IRS is the Internal Revenue Service, right? The federal agency that is tasked with collecting federal taxes. The IRS started targeting segregation academies, which are these private all-white Christian schools, threatening to revoke their tax-exempt status for refusing to admit non-whites. So again, there have been, Supreme Court decisions and laws for years and years and years now saying that like you can't be racially segregated. These white Christian schools were like, I don't care. And eventually the IRS starts coming after them. This is actually when Nixon was president, which is interesting. So for example, there's a conservative Christian college called Bob Jones University. It's in South Carolina. It's still around today. It's actually pretty influential because they produce a lot of like Christian school and homeschool curricula. And they were identified by the IRS in particular as a segregation academy, right? Again, a majority, not majority, exclusively white college that denied all non-white people access. So the IRS says, okay, well, you're going to lose your tax exempt status. And they basically threatened to do so. And so Bob Jones had to start accepting non-white applicants. I don't know why a non-white person would want to go there, but whatever. And this made a lot of Christians mad, and Christians started to get politically active. So conservative activists mobilized evangelicals around desegregation. So this is the first issue that made kind of conservative white Christians become kind of this political force, was this issue. But it was the 1970s, things were changing. You couldn't be openly racist. So they kind of changed tactic midway through the 70s, deciding to make abortion a Christian issue, right? So literally, I think the video described it, like literally these like really influential conservative political activists literally got together in a room and was like, hey, we're going to make this an issue, even though Christians don't really care about it. We're going to convince them to care about it because we think it would be a good way to mobilize Christians into into this kind of political force, right? Because again, we can't do race anymore because it's the 70s. We can't talk about race anymore. This was 5 years after Roe versus Wade. And it was successful. As more Christians came to believe the Bible teaches anti-abortion stances, it became the centralizing issue for this new voting bloc, at least initially. And to this day, like for a lot of conservative Christians, if you support abortion in any way, there's a lot of Christians who would say, well, you can't be a Christian, right? And they have this era to thank for that. So again, here's just a picture capturing this, that by the time we get to the mid-1980s, for kind of a plurality, maybe even a majority of conservative Christians, and even some liberal Christians, abortion had become the central Christian issue, right? It was the thing that, like, if you were a Christian who was politically involved, you were in support of restricting or even banning abortion as much as humanly possible, either at the federal level or at the state level, depending on what state you're living in, right? And so to this day, again, for masses of conservative Christians, abortion is this kind of like, hill to die on. And the results were that this activism was very successful. And kind of the religious right, as we now know it, was born by the time we get to the 1980s, pretty much. Basically, by the time we get to the 1980s, we can start using the term the religious right, to kind of talk about this large kind of coalition or block of religious conservatives across the country who were mobilized initially around abortion, but as we're going to find out, were eventually adopted other issues as well. And the religious right became a major reason for Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential victories. I'm sure a lot of you know that Ronald Reagan was, the president of the 1980s, basically. By then, abortion had joined issues like opposing liberalism, opposing gay rights, and opposing aid to mostly Black and poor cities, as well as supporting the traditional family, right? So really, like what a lot of conservative Christians believe today, starts to really coalesce in the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan, I think, is really the president who kind of galvanized and brought all these things together. So we're not going to deal really in depth with Ronald Reagan in this class. However, I do think it's important to know that pretty much until Donald Trump came along, Ronald Reagan was the most beloved conservative president for kind of contemporary conservatives and evangelicals as well. Reagan's presidency, I think, really marks kind of the official start of the era we're in, where conservative evangelicals, particularly conservative white evangelicals, are kind of this like very conservative, very Republican voting bloc. So to kind of like compress, several decades of history into one slide and kind of bring us up to speed to where we are now, Reagan's presidency coincided with a reinvigorated Christian nationalism, which again had been around for a long time, had really kind of like reinvigorated in the 50s, but even more so kind of came back in the 80s, largely amongst suburban and rural whites. This group would play a crucial role in various culture war issues in the ensuing decades. So basically, ever since then, anytime there's like a national emergency or crisis or disagreement, the conservative Christian perspective, especially the white conservative Christian perspective, becomes like a dominant voice in the discourse or the discussion of the disagreement. So again, for example, when Bill Clinton was president and it came out that Bill Clinton had a sexual affair with an aide and had lied about it under oath, conservative Christians were really on the attack, and conservative Christians were a large part of the reason why Bill Clinton was impeached but not removed from office for lying about his affairs. And then, of course, 9/11, right? We already talked about this, but just a quick reiteration. After 9/11, a lot of conservative Christians were saying, well, this is because God's punishing us for abortion or for accepting homosexuality or whatever. So again, the Christian conservative perspective was a really important and powerful voice in this discussion. And then leading us up to today, right? Donald Trump would not have been our president for 4 years were it not for conservative Christians, in particular white conservative Christians. And to this day, despite everything that's happened, despite the various revelations of Donald Trump, I think objectively breaking the law, are the largest continuing support and base for Donald Trump as he's running for president again. Then and now, a lot of people will ask, well, why do so many conservative Christians support someone whose personal morals are so against the teachings of historic Christianity? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but I think Christian nationalism is the most important answer to that question. There is this long tradition of particularly white Christian people believing that America has a special relationship with God. And if you really care about America, you will protect and you will support and you will fight for that heritage and that tradition. And Donald Trump, yeah, he's an immoral guy. He slept around. He's been accused of sexual assault by more than 50 women. But hey, he's fighting for Christian America. So despite how flawed he is, a lot of conservative Christians today believe that Donald Trump is their champion, right? Why? Christian nationalism. That's why. And again, part of my goal is to help us understand current political realities. Understanding Christian nationalism is really important to understand what's happening now. So I just want to close with a few thoughts, right? Let's look at the state of Christian nationalism in contemporary America. Before I do that, I just want to make some points so that we understand kind of who or what I'm talking about when I make these points and who or what I may not be talking about. So what do I mean? Okay, so here's the deal. Not all evangelicals are Christian nationalists. So I think it would be a huge mistake to kind of view Christian nationalism as a synonym for evangelicalism. There are lots of evangelicals. Evangelicalism is a very, it's racially diverse, it's politically diverse, it's theologically diverse, and not everyone who identifies as an evangelical is a Christian nationalist. Here's just an example of that. There is a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalists. These are evangelicals. Some of them are more conservative, some of them are more liberal progressive, but there are lots of Christians out there who very vocally and openly oppose Christian nationalism and think that this idea of fusing American patriotism and Christianity are kind of dangerous. So not all Christians are Christian nationalists. Additionally, not all conservatives are Christian nationalists, right? So when I'm talking about Christian nationalists, I'm not talking about all conservative people. And again, in fact, there are some very prominent and vocal conservatives who think that Christian nationalism is a bad idea. Next point, not all Christians who espouse some Christian nationalist beliefs are extreme, right? So again, there are lots of Christians out there who would say, well, yeah, America's a Christian nation, but, they're not also saying that, Christian beliefs and values should be forced onto the rest of the country, right? There are lots of Christians who think, yeah, we're democracy, and part of living in a democracy is that, like, sometimes people are going to pass laws that violate my beliefs, and, part of living in democracy is just dealing with that, right? So again, not all Christians who espouse Christian nationalist ideas are extremists. And then last point, not all Christian nationalists are white. In fact, some of the most kind of vocal proponents of Christian nationalism today are like people of non-white descent, Black people and, Latinx folks and et cetera. So all that is to say, what I'm about to say only applies to some people. So what am I going to say? Well, this is this. I'm going to put up a series of things that have happened in the past 10 years and connect them all via Christian nationalism. So QAnon. When Donald Trump was running for president, there was a movement that started online and eventually, as you can see here, moved to the streets and really kind of moved to the center of American discourse for a second. This movement basically argued that, it's hard for me to say without even laughing, but this is what they believed. The US government is controlled by a kind of secret cabal of Satan-worshiping, baby-raping cannibals, and Donald Trump was uniquely chosen by God to fight against them and bring down and expose this secret group. I am not kidding. That is actually what they believed. And what you find is, based on opinion polling, that being a conservative Christian nationalist greatly increased your likelihood of believing the QAnon conspiracy theory. Point number two, it was revealed that the 2020 election did not result in a Trump victory. Millions and millions of Americans, encouragement of Donald Trump and a lot of folks in conservative media, started saying the 2020 election was stolen, right? They started saying that Donald Trump had actually won the election, and the only reason why he hadn't is because Democratic operatives in various key swing states had basically stolen the election from him and completely subverted the democratic process. To this day, millions of people believe that, despite there being absolutely no evidence to support this claim, and despite the overwhelming evidence against this claim. It doesn't matter. Millions of people believe it, and the core of the core group of people who believe this are conservative Christian nationalists, right? See where I'm going with this? Next thing I want to talk about is the very first week of class, we talked about this kind of spate of voter suppression laws all across the country that have, emerged in the wake of this narrative that the 2020 election was stolen. Again, I think even a fair analysis of these would say these are overwhelmingly being passed in conservative states, and they're overwhelmingly being passed in conservative states where there's a desire to suppress the vote of non-conservative people in non-conservative districts. Guess who supports these? Now, a lot of people support these, but again, if you look at opinion polling, identifying as a Christian nationalist means that you are more likely to support these voter suppression laws. Well, why? Well, again, if you're a Christian nationalist, you're probably pretty aware that your viewpoint is not the dominant viewpoint in America. And how will your viewpoint become the dominant viewpoint in America? Well, to subvert democracy, right? So again, Christian nationalists, according to the opinion polling, are overwhelmingly most likely to support voter suppression laws. And last point, during the coronavirus pandemic, right? There was a huge movement, basically saying that the science around masking is junk, the science around vaccines are junk, even the science around coronavirus are junk, right? And opinion polling consistently showed that if you identify as a Christian nationalist, you are far more likely to believe that masks are not effective, you're far more likely to believe that vaccines are not effective, and you're far more likely to believe that the coronavirus was a hoax. A lot of people today believe that Christian nationalism is a huge threat to our democracy. And again, I'm not saying Christians, I'm not saying Christianity, I'm not saying evangelicals, I'm saying in particular, Christian nationalism is a huge threat to American democracy.
On the ballot this November are a number of high-profile Republican candidates who are embracing Christian nationalist ideals. That's a belief that America was founded by and for white Christians, and that the government should center its policies on those religious beliefs. Take a listen to these Republican candidates facing voters next month.
You can call us extremists, you can call us domestic terrorists. You know who else was called a lot of names his whole life? Jesus.
I'm a Christian and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church.
So much for this myth of separation of church and state.
When you look at our platform, it's the only platform out there that recognizes the Creator, that recognizes that we have rights that supersede government.
We need people all over the country to be willing to put on that full armor of God, to stand firm against the left schemes. You'll be met with flaming arrows, but the shield of faith will stop them.
Kristen Kobus-Dumais is a professor at Calvin University who studies the role of Christian nationalism in history and in today's Republican Party. And she joins me now. Kristen, thanks for joining us. The comments that we just heard, how do they espouse Christian nationalist ideals?
Really, these ideas that America is a special nation. It's God's nation, and thus true patriots, real Americans, are those who would uphold Christian values, and not just any Christian values, but a particularly kind of conservative political understanding of what it is to be a Christian and what it is to be a Christian nation.
And have we seen a greater rise of this sentiment since former President Donald Trump ran for office? Where do you see it in his rhetoric?
I think we see it certainly surfacing more. President Trump was very clear that he wanted to privilege conservative white Christians. He wanted to protect Christianity and a particular type of Christianity. And he very much used this rhetoric of us versus them. Right? He was not the president of all Americans. He was the president of his base, and he was going to promote them and privilege their ideas. And so with that rhetoric, I think it became normalized. And we started to hear that more in Christian spaces as well. More of a boldness to say that we have a right here. And also this goes hand in hand with the idea of embattlement, the idea of threat. And that was something that President Trump really excelled at, giving the sense that his followers, his base, that they were the ones who were under attack. And therefore they needed to be militant. They needed to strike out first, a kind of preemptive strike. And you see that among many Christian nationalists as well. Even though they are in the majority, and even though they have a lot of cultural and political power, they will continue to insist that they are actually the ones who are embattled. And therefore, what choice do they have but to be ruthless and to seize power?
So I would like you to reflect on this as your exit ticket. Here is a Christian nationalist who said Christian nationalism is a position that all consistent Christians need to take. What do you think? Maybe you think I'm being terrible and wrong and that Christian nationalism is actually the way to go. Maybe you think this is absolutely insane. Maybe you're somewhere in the middle. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So imagine that you're having a conversation with this man. What would you say in response to these beliefs? Not just in response to this quote, but just in response to the things that we've looked at throughout this lesson. Post something to the main Lino board, and as usual, I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts.